Okay. Welcome to this meeting. This is Assessment Task 2, Showcase and Reflection on PECs. My name is Anthony Emery, student number 8602948. Tutor's name is Chris Blundell. Workshop day is Tuesday, 9 to 12. So details on my PECs host school. So my school is a secondary grade, grade 7 to grade 12 metropolitan state school. One campus, total of 2,000 students. Class in context with Year 7 Science, mixed ability class of 24 students. All students in this class had access to BYOD, so computer, tablet, bring your own device, and learning resources were available on OneNote for students to access. So the key learning intention for this unit, Year 7 Science, was physical sciences. So they were starting to change to an object's motion is caused by unbalanced forces, including Earth's gravitational attraction, acting on an object. So that was their learning objective. So the learning intention was investigating the effects of applying different forces to familiar objects. So they're going to look at different types of forces and how it impacts objects. Okay, so for the diagnostic assessment for this unit, I gauged students' prior knowledge. So diagnostic questioning. So this activity was a 10-minute activity that was used to gauge their prior learning, starting the forces topic. So during this activity, I would provide each student with a sheet of paper, and I'd instruct them to write their name at the top of it. So I've de-identified them and actually allocated them a student letter, so student A. I'd ask students for this activity, you can see I'd ask students to fill in the blanks with the most appropriate words available at the bottom of the sheet. So at the bottom of the sheet, there was a word list, and once they filled the word in, they were then required to cross it out until all of the words were used up, using the most appropriate words. As you can see here, for this forces quiz, I've gauged students' prior knowledge and put that into a diagnostic sense. So I've put that into a spreadsheet, quiz content. So it had correct answer was using a 1 to indicate what students knew there. So their prior knowledge. This indicated here that students, as you can see, the red arrow indicating that no students knew what newtons were, so they didn't understand that newtons was the measurement used to measure a force. But prior knowledge also indicated that most students knew that pushes or pulls was a form of a force. And students also didn't know Newton's first law, so they didn't have much knowledge of that. So I use this knowledge during the unit to establish a starting point for students. So the target learning content would be around Newton's first laws to start off the unit. Throughout the unit, I use different learning experiences. So they use a lot of practical experiments to get an understanding of how forces worked. As I mentioned, students didn't know how Newton's was used as a measurement for force. So they actually got to demonstrate this using a block, dragging across different surfaces. So that would actually measure in newtons using a spring balance, how much force was required to drag that block across each surface at a steady pace. During this unit, they were required to use, during these experiments, they were required to make predictions and hypotheses about each experiment, what they thought would happen. So they're measuring forces in newtons using the spring balance, the wooden block, and they also were able to see how different forces, what different forces there are in everyday life. So they had a look at buoyancy by using different size balls with different densities, different surface areas, and they were observing how they interacted with the water with buoyancy, so how buoyant each different ball was by dropping it in a bucket of water. They also got to see magnetic forces, and they observed whether these were contact and non-contact forces, so whether they worked at a distance or they required contact. Okay. During these learning experiences, I would use quite, when it wasn't a practical lesson, I would use quite problem-solving skills, working with elbow partners or individually or in small groups, and they were asked to apply problem-solving skills to, as you can see at the top here, this lesson they're looking at rolling friction and dragging friction, sliding friction, and they were asked to, they were given a scenario where they had to drag a block up a ramp. It was a 40 kilo a box of office supplies, so stationary, and they were required to drag it up a ramp, and they were asked to provide solutions to this problem. So they weren't actually given the visual stimuli on the right with the wheels. They had to think of ways to make it simpler. The students thought of different ways to change the surface, and using the rolling friction as well. They also looked at how lubricants in cars is used to reduce friction, and how rubbing heat can actually be a disadvantage. Look at disadvantages and advantages of increased friction and decreasing friction. So in a car, decreasing friction is required, otherwise too much heat will be built up in the engine, too much friction. Formative quizzes that I used during this unit to start off with the class, along with the formative question with the quiz with the missing words. I also asked the class, each individual student was asked to come up and circle where they could see pushes and pulls. So in this picture here, this was visual stimuli that was on the board, that was projected on the board on the whiteboard, and they were asked to circle where they could identify pushes or pulls. Yep, and that was just another way to gauge their understanding. So that was a quiz-based one, but this is more of a visual stimuli for students that didn't quite understand, as this was a mixed academic class. So some students had low literacy, and yeah. Okay, so another form of formative assessment that I used an exit pass. So after the second or third lesson, I asked students to write down 3 things that I've learned from the lesson or from the unit, 2 questions that they might have, 1 thing maybe they didn't understand, and what they found interesting. So this was used to track students' progression throughout the unit, and to identify some possible lingering misconceptions they might have about forces. And if I would identify that there was quite a large quantity of students that maybe had the same misconception about a topic, let's say for example acceleration, I would then revisit that in the next lesson to consolidate their understanding. Another form of formative assessment was quite later in the unit, during my teaching experience, probably during the 3rd week, to consolidate their understanding with problem solving in real life situations. I'd actually use the forces, using friction as an example. They had to help a truck driver out named John to get out of the mud, and they had to work with their elbow partner or individually to annotate a PowerPoint slide on OneNote, and they had to identify ways to increase friction or reduce friction, and whether the reduced friction or increased friction was an advantage or a disadvantage, and they had to justify their answer. Okay, so the students, they had so the truck had watermelons in it, and a few of their solutions was to empty it out to reduce the amount of weight in it, so the amount of gravity that was pulling that truck to the ground. Students had using a winch on a tow truck to pull it, and putting rubber mats under the tires to increase friction was another example of a solution that they used. At the top here we have the feedback that I provided them. Just one sample of the feedback I provided them, and there's another way I consolidated their understanding or extended their understanding of how friction can be an advantage or disadvantage in some different circumstances. Okay, so the summative assessment that I used for this assessment was a combination of multiple question answers, or multiple choice answers. So, they were given 15 minutes to complete this quiz, where they had to revise the same kind of the same information at the start of the unit. Okay, so the formative quiz, this was the summative quiz. This was a culmination of what they've learned through the unit, and it's just revising what they have learned and to gauge some possible misconceptions that they might still have. Okay, so at the bottom of the sheet, they had to annotate where they saw the forces. So this is similar to the formative assessment that was given to the whole class at the start of the unit, where they had to identify forces. And this is kind of to demonstrate that growth, where students can actually identify different types of forces rather than just the preliminary, just the pushes and pulls. This was an extension on that. So they're looking at friction, balanced and unbalanced forces, non-contact and contact forces. And they were able to identify where they saw those forces in that picture at the bottom there. Okay, so here I have a example of what in the students' growth that they experienced during the unit. So one student at the start of the unit had a few misconceptions about newtons, how forces are measured in newtons, and about Newton's first law. As we can see in the second example on the right here, you can see the students' growth, so they can actually identify Newton's first law. Whatever is at rest will stay at rest, and whatever is in motion will stay in motion unless compelled by external force. So he was able to identify that. That was a short response there. And he was able to identify the unit of measurement used for forces. Okay, so at the end of the unit, I interpreted the summative assessment for students into a diagnostic spreadsheet. So as you can see, most students could identify what newtons, how forces are measured. Forces are measured in newtons, what Newton's laws are. At the start of the unit, they weren't able to identify that. At the end of the unit, most students were able to identify what Newton's laws were and how forces were measured in newtons. Okay, so those are my references there. Thank you for watching this video. Oh.